So this is something that is readily accessible. And if you've got things like a modern, Apple MacBook Pro, you've already got it. So I highly encourage people to go out and just see it for yourselves, because it's just hard to appreciate what a gargantuan leap this is in terms of image quality. I don't think we've had a leap this big in image quality since color came about for photography.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the LAKESCAPE Photography Podcast. This week, I had a fantastic discussion with Greg Benz, Minnesota-based landscape photographer and the software developer of the popular Lumenzia and WebSharp Pro Photoshop plugins. In this discussion, Greg and I explore a new and emerging technology coming to the photography world, HDR photography, but not in the traditional sense of blending bracketed images using software. Rather, how new hardware is making what was once impossible a simple, easy-to-use change we can all utilize and lean into in our own work. This is something that is going to change photography as we know it. As Greg explains in the episode, this is just as monumental as color coming to photography. This combination of new technologies allows us to create and share photos like never before. In this episode, Greg defines what this new technology is and how we can take advantage of it with what we are already using in the field. Join us for this discussion as Greg shares his expertise on new monitor technology and how it is enabling us to approach photography in ways never before experienced. As always, the links to the resources discussed are included in the show notes below. I encourage all of you to head over there and check out the information as you enjoy the discussion. Without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's discussion with Greg Benz. Hey, Greg, welcome to the show. It's exciting to have you on the LAKESCAPE Photography Podcast here with us today. For our listeners out there who might not be familiar with who you are and what you do, please go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Nick. Well, thanks for having me on the show. So I am a Minneapolis, Minnesota-based landscape and cityscape photographer. I'm generally known as the developer of a couple plugins for Photoshop, Lumenzia for luminosity masking and WebSharp Pro for creating some of these HDR images we'll talk about. And I'm also a Photoshop and photography instructor. But maybe the most important thing to know about me, the thing that kind of ties it all together, is I'm just a really curious person, and that photography just stokes that for me, being able to travel, explore the world, try and figure out how to, capture and share that experience with other people. I just love that aspect of photography.
Yeah, you live in a beautiful place for it too. I've been up into the Minnesota North Shore area a few times, going from Duluth all the way up to the border. And there is just some beautiful shoreline up there, beautiful parks. Do you spend much time up there?
Not as much as I'd like. And, getting from the Twin Cities on up to the North Shore, it's a solid 3 hours, and I certainly do it and I love it. And, I always keep an eye on the weather. If there's good aurora or something like that, might make a quick trip up there, but it's a haul. So tends to be kind of like a week here, a week there. But it is so beautiful. It's an overlooked part of the country. It's truly stunning. The whole area we call the North Shore, which, like you said, is basically a little bit north of Duluth up to Canada along that side of things. And I've even explored beyond them. I mean, the whole Great Lakes region, as you know, is incredible. And I feel like I've only seen kind of slices of it, even though I've lived here pretty much my whole life.
That's really awesome. And I love your background about how you're so involved in helping others by developing software, offering resources, teaching photography and Photoshop. I myself have been a longtime user of the Lumenzia plugin. I completed some of your online courses. It's been so helpful to my creative workflow. And your website has been a great resource for everything from processing to the topic we're going to be discussing today. And that's actually how I found out more about HDR. Now we've got you here on the show so you can share this process with others and help others dive into this whole new world of photography. To start this all off, can you share the difference between the old HDR, the new HDR, why this is so exciting?
Yeah. So when we say HDR, the term stands for high dynamic range. And it is unfortunately creating a lot of confusion because we've thrown that term around over the years to mean different things. So like 15 years ago or so, there was a pretty big fad around software like photomatics and things like that, where you would process your images. People would sort of take multiple exposures and combine them, and then use this process called tone mapping to actually create that kind of HDR. And while it was popular for a time, a lot of people I think grew to kind of dislike it over the years. That the colors are too strong, there's too much noise, the shadows are too light, and it has kind of a bad rap. That's not to say that it's not a good technique, but it's controversial. Now there's something that has the exact same name, which makes it very confusing, but it's completely different. But it's trying to solve the same problem, so it has the same name. So when we say high dynamic range now, what we're actually talking about is not just software like we had back then. It's really about having new display hardware. So the old HDR, the concept there was our digital cameras, human vision, we are able to capture and see this broad range of dynamic light in the real world. But the monitors that we've had, they had not improved for decades. The dynamic range of a monitor in like 1970s television and what people have been using up till recently was kind of the same. And the old HDR was about taking this amazing raw file we captured with our camera and squeezing it down and making all these compromises and trade-offs to try and simulate what we saw on basically a low capability display, what we would now call standard dynamic range, or SDR. The new HDR, this is new hardware technology that actually is a much more capable monitor. So now when we say HDR, we're really talking about taking our raw files, processing them with new software techniques and all, but showing them on a monitor which could actually replicate what the camera saw. So you think back to the earlier days of digital cameras. We used to see like the latest review would come out. They talk about, oh, this camera has an extra half stop or a full stop of extra dynamic range compared to its predecessor. And how that was like super exciting. We'd go buy a new camera for just like half a stop or one stop. Well, with this HDR, you're getting up to 4 stops of extra capability right away in your display. And we'll probably eventually see up to about 6 stops with this. So you're greatly enhancing your ability to display real light on a monitor. And the result is just incredible. You really have to see it to understand it. But when you see it, you're going to be looking at sunsets that are bright and colorful, or details that stand out, or city lights that truly glow, or the details of a bride's dress are still visible, and yet you can still see the shadow detail of the groom's tux next to her. Just the ability to truly see the real world on a display now is just so vastly beyond anything we had in the past. That's what this new HDR is about, is a real technological revolution that is going to just completely change the future of photography.
That's incredible and very exciting stuff because, yeah, like you said, when all of us think HDR, we think back 10, 15 years ago to photomatics, or we're blending images, we're stacking, we're taking a bracketed sequence of everything and plugging it into software and allowing it to kind of figure out those highlights, those shadows. And I presume it was to the end goal of the software, the algorithm working behind the scenes was simply attempting to crush it all into that SDR space. Whereas now we don't have to do that, is essentially what this new hardware technology is allowing us to accomplish. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically the old HDR was, it couldn't make the screen any better, but what it was trying to do was to simulate a better display by adjusting local contrast and doing some pretty sophisticated, calculations and all. And there are various techniques, ways you can try and show, the 14 stops of dynamic range from your raw file on the limited 8 stops of a standard dynamic range display. But no matter how you cut it, it's just not as capable as the data is. So you have to make a compromise somewhere. You can clip the data, you can compress it, meaning reduce the contrast, or you can try and get a little fancy where maybe you darken the sky. And so the sky still has contrast and the foreground still has contrast, but you've kind of broken the relationship between them. right? And that can look pretty good. I mean, there's a lot of cases where that makes sense, and we can do pretty good with that. I don't know that HDR necessarily really did the best job. Things like luminosity masks and exposure blending are much better for that, and they're still relevant now, but those are some of the best tools for SDR. But it's a complicated job of trying to take all that dynamic range and show it on a compromised display because something has to give. It's just not physically capable of it. So that's what's so great about what we have now is the ability to take these files and if not completely eliminate the trade-offs, make them much, much smaller so we can show things the way that they are. It's just like a completely new canvas to paint on, if you will.
So it's essentially unlocking the full potential of our raw files instead of being limited by the dynamic range of the monitor. Now we have access to that actual highlight data, the bright spots in our sunrises, our sunsets, like you mentioned. What is the dynamic range of an older monitor approximately versus these newer ones?
So I'm gonna quote somewhat generically. I've read different scientific studies and reports on this, and I've never tried to replicate it myself. It'd be pretty difficult to do this in a truly scientific way, and I'm not deep enough on it. But my general understanding of this, after looking at it quite a bit, is that a standard dynamic range display is typically about 8 stops of dynamic range. You might hear a quote as low as like 6 stops, but I think 8 is about right. With a high dynamic range display, you are clearly getting multiple stops more. So it's much more obvious how many additional stops HDR has. You can really measure that. And the kind of best in class these days would be things like Apple's XDR displays. XDR is Apple's way of saying a really good HDR display. And that's on pretty much all the MacBook Pros going back to 2020, all the Apple Silicon, laptops, their fancy high-end display, the new iPad, they have these XDR displays, and they'll offer up to 4 stops of additional dynamic range. But if you look at the world of television and the standards where we're going, you're going to see up to 6 stops of dynamic range. That's probably the upper limit of where this technology is likely to go based on the most deep and rigorous studies that have been done. And beyond that might even get to the point of not being that comfortable to view. So you're probably going to see an additional 6 stops at the end of it. So kind of summing that up, SDR, standard dynamic range, is about 8 stops. You're getting up to 12 now with HDR, probably headed towards 14. And if you think about our raw files typically will capture up to about 14 and a half stops of dynamic range. So we are already at a point where we can capture most of what is in that raw that was missing in SDR. And we'll probably get even a little bit better in the next 5 or 10 years. I mean, some of the stuff I've seen in televisions as I go to some of these like conferences and shows, looking at the technology myself, it's pretty exciting to look at what's coming next, even though the stuff that's already available is already amazing.
Yeah, I've seen some of these screens in person. I actually use a MacBook Pro with the XDR display, and it is phenomenal. It's so much different than a standard display. And to your point earlier, it's something you have to see to really appreciate. And to be able to actually look at it and physically see differences side by side just between the monitors, not even necessarily the edits or the raw files before you start really digging into HDR, is incredible. But then when you flip the HDR toggle on and you see how it quite literally glows, it actually looks as if you were standing there looking at it. That's really cool.
I think it's so important to see it. It's so hard to appreciate how transformational this technology is until you see it. And the cool thing is, it's actually super common because we kind of had to build up the hardware before anyone would go and release the software. And we're at that point now where the software is coming out. So it's actually far more common than people realize. Like on Instagram, we have full support for it. And about 80% of people have a smartphone that's going to show the HDR benefit. So most people listening to this podcast, if you just grab your phone, go to the Instagram app, you can go to my profile, which is just Greg Benz Photography on Instagram. And I've got side-by-side comparisons of standard images and HDR images. So you can see the benefit right on your phone. So this is something that is readily accessible. And if you've got things like a modern, Apple MacBook Pro, you've already got it. So I highly encourage people to go out and just see it for yourselves because it's just hard to appreciate what a gargantuan leap this is in terms of image quality. I don't think we've had a leap this big in image quality since color came about for photography.
Yeah. I mean, it's very impressive, very exciting stuff. And that's something that I wanted to talk about here as well is the technology itself. It's exciting. And the HDR displays that we're beginning to see, what can we achieve now that was not possible before other than just unlocking that full dynamic range of our cameras and having it on the monitor itself? How do you feel this is going to change approaching photography as a whole?
Yeah. So the technology, to break it down to the simplest level, with an HDR display, what you really have is the ability to make a pixel much brighter than we could in the past without losing the deep shadow detail. And in fact, the shadows are getting even darker because most monitors we've used in the past are these LCD monitors where you shine a backlight through an LCD layer. And so the blacks really aren't black. Now we're developing mini LED where the backlight doesn't shine everywhere, just where it's needed, or OLED where each pixel lights itself. And so now we have this technology that lets a pixel get really bright and really dark. And that's what's new. And that sounds like, okay, great, we have brighter pixels. But what that actually means is that you can now show highlight detail that was completely missing before. So if you think back to the fundamental challenge of I have a 14 stop raw file and I'm going to show it on an 8 stop standard dynamic range display. Well, I have to give up something. And the thing that we always give up in the past are the highlights, right? The highlights of what that sensor captured is the first thing to go because we see best in the dark, right? As light gets brighter, 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 we become less sensitive to it. So we care a lot about shadows and midtones. And so we want to make sure those are correct. So we don't just compress the whole tonal range for a limited display. We basically discard the brightest data. So those highlights will either get clipped or what we'd say rolled off, where basically the contrast is reduced to such a low level, you kind of lose it. And what that means is when you look at your raw file and you think, oh, wow, that sky looks blown out. It's like it was a blue sky with clouds, but on my monitor, it looks like white. Now, if you've ever had an image like that and you take the raw and then you suddenly bring down the highlight slider or you bring down the exposure slider and the detail comes back, well, we'd say, oh, you recovered highlights, but it's not like the data wasn't in the file. It was always there. You just could not see it because your monitor wasn't capable. And so if you've ever had that experience of darkening your raw file and you see some new information in the image, like the color comes back or the detail comes back, that's exactly what HDR is going to give you. So HDR is really about having color and detail in the highlights that got lost before. And so that means things like if I'm shooting inside a building and there's like, I'm in someone's living room and I can see detail outside the window. Well, normally that window is just like blown out white, but in HDR, I might still be able to see the detail outside the window and yet still see the shadow detail inside the room. Or if I'm shooting and someone's got, like I mentioned, the bride's dress, right? You get a high white detail. You just can't see the fine details of texture when you have a white dress because it's just too close to the limits of that display. It loses that contrast. Or the sunset, right? Where you get the sunset and you're like, oh, in real life, it was so much more colorful. But if you process your raw file dark enough so you can see the color and the detail in the sky, suddenly like you don't see the rocks and the detail in the foreground of your image, like it's gone, whereas in HDR, you can still have the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. You see all of that detail. So that's what it's really all about, is at the end of the day, it's having those better highlights, and that's where you really see a difference. So the images that will truly pop will be things like you're shooting a city, especially at night where there's lights in the city, or you're shooting a sunset and the range from the lit clouds to the foreground is so tremendous. Or you're shooting in a place where you've got mixed light, like that interior, but you can see out the windows. Anything where there's really dynamic light, it's going to look amazing. That's actually a super high percentage of the images we take will have those kinds of crazy lighting conditions. Now, I mean, not every image will benefit from this. Like if I'm shooting, say, a flat lit portrait under studio lights, or I'm shooting in a forest when there's a lot of fog. I mean, some images do not have or need a lot of contrast and wouldn't necessarily benefit from HDR, right? So this is not for all images, but for a lot of images, you see this tremendous benefit because you've removed that compromise that basically ruined the highlight detail in the photo.
I encourage the listeners to, if you have an image of a sunrise or a sunset, just bring it into Camera Raw or bring it into Lightroom and toggle that HDR on and watch what happens to the really bright areas. Because I did it on one of my images and they went from a gray, muted kind of green look to vibrant, colorful, filled with detail, exactly like Greg is saying. And it's amazing how much detail we've actually essentially compromised on for so long that we can now finally see. It's very exciting. For those listening, why is now a great time to get started moving down this path of new technology?
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly getting to HDR today, it's not like any other image, right? There is a little bit of extra effort required to get into this space now. But I think this is a great time to dive into it because we now have easy access to a lot of editing capability. Like if you have an Apple display since like 2018, you very likely have this technology. And if you have an M1 or later MacBook Pro, you have basically some of the best display capability you can buy. It may only be a 14 or 16-inch display, but it's a really good one. Aside from that, this is growing in PC laptops, external monitors. There are quite a few options in this space, so it's very easy to get in and actually see it for editing purposes. And then in terms of the actual editing itself, we now have widespread support in software for this. So pretty much every piece of Adobe software has this. Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, every version of Lightroom. I'm talking on Android, iPhone, the website version of Lightroom, Cloud, Classic. It all has it, as well as Affinity, Photomatics. There's a lot of ways to actually do the edit. And then when you go to share it, this is the part that's still a little bit difficult because getting the file from you to your audience can be a little bit tricky, but there's already some really good channels. Like if you maintain your own website, you can easily do this now. Or Instagram has native support for HDR photos, so does Threads. So you can share on these platforms. And the great news is that your audience, especially these mobile first platforms, will have good support for this. Like the standard for mobile phones going back to 2020 is HDR. Most modern phones have HDR support. So when you share an HDR photo on Instagram, most people, the majority, like 80%, if not higher, are going to see the HDR benefit. And you can share it in a way where if someone doesn't have support for HDR, they're still going to get a great result. In fact, you can give them the exact same result they would have had if they don't have HDR. And that's I think the most important thing here is we've got this technology called a gain map, which allows us to create the benefit of HDR for people who have it without waiting for some far off world where every single device has support. So you can easily get into this now and know that your audience is going to have an experience which is either much better or just as good as what you had in the past.
As you go out into the field and you are shooting images, does this change your approach in the field at all, or what file types you should be using and saving to your SD card as you're shooting?
So if you've already been shooting in an optimal way, no, it won't change anything. So you want to be shooting, always, good composition and lighting, is a given. But shooting raw, that's very important. You can shoot in formats which capture HDR detail, like HEIF, as an alternative. But that's kind of like shooting JPEG versus RAW. You're still getting a better result with RAW. So you still want to shoot RAW, obviously with the highest bit depth you can in your RAW format. And you want to expose to the right, meaning as bright as you can without clipping highlight details. And most people should already be doing those things. But if you're not, you're going to want to get practice with it. They're going to benefit you for all images, but especially for HDR, because with HDR, you're using more of the raw file. So any mistake you make is going to be a little bit more constraining because you need that raw file to be high quality. But that's really no different than exactly what I would tell you to do if you didn't have the desire to edit for HDR. So it's really the same stuff. And I have super old raw files going back to like 2004 was my first digital SLR. And I have great examples of detail that I just didn't even realize was lurking in my raw file that comes through in HDR. So even if you haven't been shooting for this, you're probably going to find a lot of examples where the image just looks much better with HDR. So it's almost a given. Like the shooting part of this is very, very easy. You don't need new gear. You really don't need to shoot any different. You can just kind of do the same thing you've been doing. And just the difference will be in how you edit and how you share. I should add one thing here because this question does come up a lot. A lot of people ask me, do I quote, still need to shoot multiple exposures like bracket? Because a lot of people who did the old HDR did that. I don't think that was ever necessary, to be frank. Like in the old HDR, you had a raw file that was better than your monitor. Now you take different exposures and combine them, you're just making the problem worse. You're creating even greater dynamic range you cannot show. So I don't think that was ever necessary. That was a bit of a fallacy that that was necessary. Usually people do that because their exposure technique is really loose and sloppy. And if you don't have a good exposure, then it helps to have kind of other exposures because one of them's correct is what it amounts to. So you really don't need that. I would say I almost never bracket for the purpose of editing HDR. You can, and there are times when it will benefit you. The primary benefit is going to be in having less noise in your shadows. And I think where that's going to make the most difference is if you're the kind of person who wants to edit for HDR, but you also want to print, I think that noise is going to be a lot more visible when you go to print, simply because when you share the HDR, you're probably going to be sharing on a smaller screen, right? At most, it's going to be like a 32-inch screen. Maybe it's your 85-inch big screen TV in your living room, maybe. But for the most part, when you go to print, you're going to have much higher resolution, bigger sizes, and the noise will show up there. So there are some situations where I might bracket for noise reduction, but AI noise reduction is so good these days. I can't think of a scenario where I couldn't capture the image correctly with a single frame. If you can't do that, I think you need to go back and work on how you capture the image. You do not need to bracket for HDR.
That's exactly what I was going to mention as well is, do you still need to be bracketing for this or can you just do it out of a single image? And, myself personally, at sunrises and sunsets, things of that nature, I'll bracket with intention of exposure blending. And that's typically my kind of standard approach there. But it's great that knowing HDR doesn't require that same approach. That changes things. It saves memory card space. It saves you time having to try to bracket images. And that's definitely something that people can benefit from when they're out there, shooting these images. Do you still want to be shooting to the right as you're planning out an HDR exposure, or can it be kind of open for interpretation based on the needs?
I mean, you definitely ideally want to shoot to the right. Whenever you can, shoot at the base ISO, 164, whatever the base ISO for your camera is, and expose to the right. That's the ideal exposure in terms of high quality pixels. That's not necessarily the best choice though, right? If I'm shooting, say, someone kayaking down a river at sunset, they might be moving too fast to do that, right? And if I have to accept less dynamic range and more noise, so be it. Because if you don't get the shot, who cares how good the pixels are, right? So there's always those trade-offs there, but you really never need to, there's no benefit to deviating from exposing to the right at base ISO in terms of image quality. There may be other reasons to do it, like making sure your shutter speed's fast enough to capture the action. But you don't need to darken that down. So for some people, that's going to be a new approach because some people, I think, with SDR, you can shoot kind of sloppy, right? I mean, think about a 14 stop, raw capture versus 8 stops on the screen. You can be way off the mark and no one's going to know. If you underexpose that image, you can kind of bring some of it back usually. And if you overexpose it, well, highlights were the thing we're already letting go. So blowing a few stops in the highlights on SDR, who cares? But if you blow the highlights and you're going to process the image for HDR, well, now you've lost data that you could show, and that's a problem. So ideally, you're going to expose to the right.
Yeah, that's something that I've noticed in my experience out in the field, and something that actually brings a question to mind. Color is going to be dependent on our exposure settings. A darker exposure, we're going to end up with darker colors. A lighter exposure, we're going to end up with brighter colors. Now, as you're setting up your scenes and taking these considerations in the field, if you're shooting a single image, does the recovery HDR offers, does that help you in that regard of if you do shoot to the right, maybe your color is a little washed out, or if you do underexpose a little because you needed to do so based on needs or the scene or what have you, does HDR help protect those colors in those brighter and darker areas like it would traditionally in a bracket?
As long as you're capturing something within the range of what the camera can do, it's going to be the same. If let's say I'm shooting a basketball and I shoot one frame where it's deeply underexposed and another frame where it's exposed super, super bright, but I didn't blow out the basketball. Maybe I blew out something, the top of the frame, but not the basketball, right? The only difference between those two raw images, once I make an appropriate exposure slider adjustment in Lightroom to equal them out, will be the noise. It'll be the exact same orange. If I make the dark one brighter or the bright one darker or change both, when I bring them in the same value, it will look the same, except that the darker exposure will be noisier. So whatever is darker in the frame has more noise, and the brighter you get, the better until you clip. Once you clip a channel or a pixel, now the quality falls off rapidly. And that's why we expose to the right. So as long as you're not blowing your highlights, brighter is better. You won't lose any color there. That's the capture side of the equation. The display side of the equation is a bit different, right? So if you think about the monitor technology, let's say I'm shooting a blue sky, right? It's predominantly blue sky. Well, when I light that up, well, a pure blue is going to be comprised of like the subpixels, because our monitors are red, green, and blue subpixels that make up each individual pixel. And so at some point, I can't get any brighter in a pure blue than that blue subpixel. And, that's not very bright. It's nowhere near as bright as what we would perceive as white on that monitor. If I want to make that blue sky, which should be bright, if I want to make it brighter, then the monitor has to start turning on the red and the green subpixels to add some brightness to that pixel. But that means that it's going to be shifting away from a pure blue. It's going to be getting more desaturated. The more I increase the red and green content, the more I'm moving in the direction of being white. So when it comes to a monitor, the brighter your value is, the more you're at the limits of what your monitor can actually show you. So with an HDR monitor, the red, green, and blue can get much, much brighter. So if I have a pixel which is near the limits of blue in an SDR monitor, I'm probably going to see a much richer, better blue on an HDR monitor simply because it can use the blue without having to rely on the reds and the greens. So generally speaking, you're going to see more and better color in your HDR images, not because of what you captured in the camera or even what you edited, but just simply because the monitor doesn't have to make those same trade-offs because it's just a better technology.
That makes sense. That's awesome. So, for those listening out there that are curious about this, what monitor should people be looking at, or what monitors do they need to get started? How can they test the equipment that they already own?
Yeah, I always tell people the first place to start is just see it, experience it, have a sense for it. If you don't have the technology, go to the Apple store, go to a phone store, go look on your friend's computer, whatever. These displays are all over the place. Chances are a lot of people listening to this have 1, 2, or even 3 HDR displays already and don't know it. Most televisions have this. It's been rolling out since 2016 for televisions. Almost all Apple products have it. It's very hard to find an Apple product doesn't have it. I mean, all the computers have it, all the iPhones have it. I think the low end of the iPad's the only place you can't get it now. The PC laptop market, there's quite a bit of it. There's just so many different ways you can access an HDR display right now. But for most people, that's going to be your phone is almost certainly going to have it. It's very, very likely with any modern phone. So I would try and experience it first. And then in terms of editing, I would also try and start with the technology you have. So if you already have, a modern mobile phone, Pixel and iPhone are supported by Lightroom now. You can use Lightroom in HDR mode on the phone. If not that, then your computer may have support for HDR now. And I've got tests to determine the capability of your monitor on my website. So if you go to gregbenzphotography.com/HDR, there's a bunch of tests. And the first test there will tell you exactly how much HDR you currently have, which is kind of a function of your hardware and if it's configured right. So kind of read the support articles there. But there's a good chance you'll have it, especially if you have an Apple laptop of any kind, which has a great HDR display. And if you don't have, the phone or a laptop that has it already, your TV, can usually be used as a monitor. So you can take your laptop and plug into your big screen TV, which probably has a great HDR capability. And again, on my website, I have information on how you would set that up properly. It may not work by default, but you just plug your computer in with an HDMI cable and you can get great HDR on your TV. So that's where I would start, would be just, with the options that are freely available to you, get some experience with it before you go out and invest in any new purchase. But if you get to the point where you would like to look at technology, right? So we can have this conversation now where, what do you want? There's a bunch of different terms that get tossed around for these displays. A lot of manufacturers will tout the fact that they have HDR10 or HDR 400. These are like different specifications. If it says HDR10 or HDR10 Plus or Dolby Vision, that just means that it can interpret an HDR video signal. It doesn't mean it's a good HDR display. Doesn't even necessarily mean it actually will show HDR necessarily. So that doesn't tell you a lot. When you see like this HDR with a bigger number, like HDR display, HDR 400 or 600 or 1000, that's telling you it's been certified to a test for its level of HDR capability. 400 is more or less like, if you have it, that's nice, use it, but I would not go out and buy one of those. That is a low level of capability that's not impressive in general. HDR 600, meaning it's more or less like 600 nits, which is measure of brightness. That's where things start getting pretty interesting, especially if, that's where things get interesting if you work in a darker room, right? If you don't have a lot of ambient light streaming into the windows, you don't need as bright of a monitor to appreciate the benefit. So a 600 nits OLED, especially in like a darker room, is great. But 1000 nits, that HDR 1000 or higher, that's really what you want to look for. Not every monitor is tested to those standards. Like Apple doesn't participate, so you won't see an HDR 1000 rating on them. But Apple will tell you it's a 1000 nits or 1600 nits of HDR brightness. When you see 1000 or more, you know that that's probably going to be a pretty exciting monitor to look at. I think 1000 nits or more, that's the key thing that people need to know about. And I've got a whole like article on my site about how to purchase these. There's some other considerations. But the one other thing I'll mention is that's the brightness side of the equation. But it also matters, like, can you keep good blacks on your display? And for that question, there's kind of two major technologies you would buy. There's OLED and there is mini LED. What you need to know about those is OLED is a technology where each pixel lights up on its own. So it can always make a perfect black. So you have really good shadow detail at all times, assuming the room's dark enough to see it and appreciate it. The problem with OLED is historically, they don't tend to get as bright. So an OLED tends to be like a good choice in a darker room, but they have great shadow detail. And then there's mini LED. In a mini LED, what you're doing is there's a backlight that gets shared amongst a bunch of different pixels. So if I have some kind of bright thing or even just a lit pixel, you cannot achieve a perfect black around it. So the blacks are not as good, but they're getting pretty good. It's not a big deal, but in general, OLED is a little more optimal if you work in a light controlled environment, and mini LED is probably the better choice for a lot of people today, just because it'll let you show more HDR and it'll keep up better in a bright room. But I think we'll see more and more of the exciting updates over time on the OLED side of things. Asus has a new OLED monitor coming out this week. I'm actually going to get in a few days here. I'm really excited to try out that. It's like 1,000 nits OLED, which is starting to crack into an interesting territory for OLED. I think that'll be really interesting. So there's a lot of options, and it definitely is going to be a dynamic environment. I can hardly keep up with myself, and I'm spending most of my time on this topic these days. So probably the best thing I'd say is if you go to my webpage again to the monitor recommendations, check that out, because I'm updating that like weekly with like the latest stuff, as well as a deeper explanation of the topics I'm talking about here in terms of what you want to see for these monitors. But the short answer is 1,000 nits or more is usually telling you that that's going to be a pretty good HDR monitor.
That's incredible that that technology is out there, and it's not just out there, it's transforming so quickly and becoming available in so many aspects of our lives. And like you said, it's in our phones, it's in our iPads, it's on our computers, it's in our TVs, it's everywhere. And now we can finally take advantage and capitalize on the benefits as photographers. That's really exciting. And I think that's going to change a lot of things as far as how we approach photography. But in there, you had mentioned editing as well and how we approach our edits. Now, does this change anything in our editing approach as far as what we've been doing? Do we have to upend anything, or is it all really similar to what it was before with the exception of the HDR toggle?
So if you're using Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, Adobe's done a really nice job with this. I've worked with HDR video, and that can be fairly difficult. What Adobe has done with Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, I think, is just so beautiful. You go in there, right next to the same button you'd use for like black and white. Right next to the black and white button is the HDR button you're talking about. If you're on a tablet or a phone, it's in a slightly different place, but you turn on the HDR mode. And when you do that, then the image is likely going to show new detail. Not necessarily, it depends on what the image is and how you've already processed it, but it probably immediately shows like a benefit. And the other thing you'll see is the histogram changes. So what used to be the full histogram squeezes to like the left half of the histogram. And then the right-hand side is the new HDR range, because HDR is everything brighter than what we used to call white. In the world of SDR white, that's known as diffuse white. That was the old maximum. Now, everything that's brighter than that is HDR. And on the histogram in Lightroom, you'll see these little bars, which are showing the number of stops, which we all know from photography. So you see up to 4 stops of dynamic range in that histogram. You can actually go beyond that, but that's just kind of what they show in the histogram. That's all you need to do these days. So that would be the immediate difference, would be the image probably looks better. The histogram looks different. The only other thing you'll notice changes will be the curve itself has bigger range, because it needs to allow you to go into the HDR range. But all the editing settings work really pretty much the same. There's almost no learning curve at all for that. There is like one other little section that is a preview for SDR display. And that's really about how do you export the image. So that's kind of a separate consideration. But the actual edit process in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw is very, very similar to what we're used to. So that makes it super easy to approach it. When it comes to Photoshop, in the world of Photoshop, HDR means 32-bit mode. So we're used to working at 8 or 16. If you're doing Astro, maybe you've dabbled in 32, but 32 is the world of HDR. And a lot of it still works the way you're used to, but some tools are not available. Like, for example, like the liquify tool is not an option, or some blend modes like overlay are not currently available. And hopefully we'll see that. You can do that in video for HDR. So there's no reason we can't do it. But this technology is just being rolled out everywhere. So there's really good support in 32-bit Photoshop. But I think that is a little bit of a different experience, mostly because some of the tools you're used to might work a little bit different or aren't available. And you can still do everything you need to do, but you might have to think a little bit about what's the new approach in 32-bit Photoshop. So I would tell people, just start with Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw because it's really, really easy. You get great results now. And if you want to go beyond that, Photoshop's ready to support you. Just know that there's going to be a little bit more of a learning curve there, though it's really not that hard.
That's great that there's not a big shift to editing and that all these major players are actively working on incorporating this into workflows so it can become standard process as the technology continues to move forward.
That's the process of editing like a raw file for HDR, which is the best way to extract the most detail from your raw, right? Is to work right from raw to HDR. But you don't have to do that. You can actually take an image you've already edited and upgrade it to HDR. And for a lot of images, that will be a transformational improvement to the image. I have quite a few of the images that I share as HDR on my website or on Instagram are images that I have printed for a client, which is an SDR process. We don't have HDR for printing today. I've edited in a standard way, and then I upgraded it for Instagram or website later as HDR. So, even as easy as these tools are to approach now for HDR editing, you can do a regular edit and still at the tail end make an HDR version and get the benefit of the technology online. And that's very easy to do. It takes me about 20 seconds to do that to an image.
That's great because that's one thing that I was actually thinking about as you were explaining that. Like, do I have to go back and re-edit every picture I've ever taken? It's gonna take me ages, But that's awesome. And I mean, when it comes to that exporting, sharing the image, that was the part that really tripped me up when I first went down this rabbit hole of what is HDR? How do I process with this? And how do I get it out for the world to see? And, once you complete an edit, how do you share it?
The key thing to think about here that's different than we're used to, right? I mean, we've always had different monitors. Your monitor is P3, mine's more tuned to Adobe RGB, someone else's sRGB. There's always been some differences, but we mostly just kind of create one edit and we sort of overlook the fact that there's a little bit of a difference there. In the world of HDR, we now have monitors that are so much better that we don't want to just simply share an HDR image as it is edited for HDR on its own. Because if I do that and you don't have HDR, or maybe your monitor has HDR, but it's like one of those less capable HDR monitors, then the browser needs to do something. And they're not going to clip the image, right? I mean, that would be easy. It could just blow out all the highlights. It's going to try and adapt to the image and it'll do tone mapping. And that's the old HDR, the one that a lot of people don't like very much. And it's also going to vary from one browser to the next. So you end up with a lot of problems when you go that route. In terms of your HDR image can look degraded on someone else's monitor. The solution to that is to use a special augmentation to an image known as a gain map. And a gain map is not a new file format. It's an improvement to the files we already have. So you can use a gain map with JPEG today, and that will make your JPEG be capable of HDR and capable of being displayed on anyone's display. So if I take my HDR image, I can export with a gain map. So you think back to, I mentioned during the editing in Lightroom, there's that preview for SDR display. That's the fallback version. When you look in that section of Lightroom, there's 7 little sliders that let you control what is the SDR version of this HDR edit. You're basically making 2 edits, but you're just moving a couple sliders to get there. So it's not much work, but it's giving you artistic control to say, hey, if my viewer doesn't have HDR or they don't have good HDR, what are they going to get, right? And that's that kind of fallback version. So the gain map is basically encoding both the fallback standard dynamic range and the enhanced HDR image in the same JPEG. And that way, when it then gets to you, you will either see the benefit of HDR or you won't. But if you don't see HDR, you will still see a great looking SDR image. And that's true even if your browser doesn't understand HDR at all, or doesn't understand gain maps. So that's the beauty of this standard, is it's fully backwards compatible when it's used with a JPEG. So I could take a computer and a monitor and a browser from the 1990s, and open up one of these HDR JPEG game maps, and it's still going to look great. It's not going to be HDR, but it's still going to look great. It's a safe thing to share. And that's the key, is that it looks good anywhere, and it's very, very easy to make the images this way. So that's what we're doing, is doing these gain maps. And the gain map, like I said, is not just any one format. So JPEG is the way to do it now, because that gives us full compatibility everywhere. But JPEG is not too close or not too far away from being replaced. We have better file formats on the horizon, like AVIF, which is AVIF. That's a file format which offers higher quality. It actually has native ability to encode HDR even without a gain map, though you still want a gain map to let it adapt in an optimal way. AVIF is probably a year from now going to be the way that we want to share these images. You take an AVIF with a gain map. But even though AVIF is supported for standard images now on all browsers, not everyone's updated, and we don't have support for the HDR version in AVIF yet. So it's not safe yet, but we will be headed in the direction of something even better than JPEG in a year. But what we have with it right now is already awesome, because it's the same JPEG we've already been sharing, but now you have the benefit of HDR for people who are able to appreciate it on their displays, which thankfully is actually quite a few people already.
Yeah, so it's essentially taking the AVIF file is essentially taking your SDR image, and then it's taking the HDR image and the gain map, and it's allowing it, that HDR and SDR image, to kind of live in the same place and be displayed per requirements by whoever's viewing it, if I'm following that correctly.
That's what the gain map does. The gain map lets anybody see it, no matter what your capability is. It's not specific to JPEG or AVIF. That's kind of a separate consideration. So you can think about the choice of JPEG versus AVIF really being a question of JPEG is more compatible today, but AVIF will be a better choice in the future, mostly because the files are much smaller, like 30 to 50% smaller. So that's a beautiful benefit, that we can download bigger images faster, and they have better quality. Like AVIF, when it has artifacts, they look better than a JPEG, and it has higher bit depth. So it's an overall better image, but we're not ready for it just yet. But soon, that'll be the way to go. There's a bit of confusion for folks who are familiar with AVIF today. You can share an AVIF now with HDR, but without a gain map. And I always tell people, you should definitely not do that. The reason for that is, I think some people think gain maps are like a hack to bring HDR into JPEG, because JPEG is only a 10-bit file. I'm sorry, JPEG is only an 8-bit file, whereas AVIF is 10 to 12. So there's this misperception that the purpose of a gain map is to do HDR as a hack in a low capability file. That's not the purpose. I mean, that is a benefit of it, certainly. But the real benefit is this ability to ensure that when someone sees your image, it always looks good, no matter what display, no matter what browser. If I share an AVIF image with someone who has a less capable display and I don't give them a gain map, well, I'll get a different result in Firefox, Safari, and Chrome. And some of those will look pretty bad, and none of them will be controlled by my input as an artist. Whereas if I share an image with a gain map, and I'm talking in AVIF now or JPEG or whatever, then I know what you're going to see. It's predictable, and it's a higher quality result. So that's why these gain maps are so important. And this idea of adapting to less capable displays, I don't think we're ever going to get away from it. Even if every single person had the best HDR display on the market now, these screens, HDR is the difference between your SDR content brightness and whatever's left over. When my screen needs to get brighter because I walk outside using my phone, or I'm in bright shade or near a window, the available room for HDR gets decreased. So you not only need to have good HDR like indoors, you need to have it, everywhere you go. So with all the places that these images get viewed, even an image, even like an iPhone, which will support 3 stops of HDR right now, sometimes it won't support any HDR. If I go outside on a cloudy day, I might not have HDR capability left over, because that screen has to get so bright just to overcome the brightness outside. There's just nothing left over. So we're always going to have this need for adaptation. unless we got to some weird future state where the screens were just absurdly bright, that I don't see happening. So it's an important concept. It's not a hack. It's going to be around for the long term. Um, but I think the key takeaway for people listening to this is just be aware that there's a way to make sure everyone sees your image that it will look great on any display, and it's called a gain map. And as long as you're exporting with a gain map, you're going to be ensuring that what looks great on your screen will look great on someone else's screen, regardless of the technology they're using.
That's very cool that technology's out there, that it can be compatible with both at the same time, and everybody can enjoy your work, because that's ultimately our end goal. Is we go to these places, we take photos, we want to share, we want everybody to be able to enjoy it and experience it. And having that ability is huge. So that's awesome. The one last question that I really had is, when we're doing these HDR images, when it comes to printing, what does that look like? Can we still print these images? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. That comes up quite a lot. So if you think back to that definition I said of HDR is everything brighter than SDR white. Well, when we print, the paper is defined as that SDR white point. So by definition, every pixel that's in the HDR range would require ink that glows in the dark. That would be how you would print a direct HDR. So we are not going to take an HDR and print it directly. You could print it out of Lightroom and it'll do it. It'll dumb it down. It'll tone map it down to the paper. But again, you're back to tone mapping. You're back to the old HDR. It's going to produce an inferior result if you do that. You want to take artistic control of that process to print an SDR, which, you could take your HDR and manually bring it down to SDR. There's great ways to do that. That's an option. You could do a separate edit. That's unnecessary, but it's an option. Or what I think is going to work most for people who want to do a lot of printing is just edit your regular image for SDR, for print. Make the best possible SDR image you can. And then, like I mentioned earlier, upgrade that to HDR. So you'll be able to create a great looking print using the same workflow you've always used. And then at the very tail end, with like 20 seconds of work, you can upgrade it for HDR or even less. My plugin, WebSharp Pro for Photoshop, can fully automate the process. You can be as hands-on or hands-off as you want to be with this kind of work. So it's a great way to make an image that looks amazing for print and can look even better on an HDR display. And when you do it that way, the HDR is being derived from your print-ready version. So it's going to be pretty consistent. And if you do it the right way, you're actually not going to have like a big discrepancy between the print and the HDR. It's going to look much better on the screen, but they don't have to be that far off. So you can kind of take it wherever you want it to be. So I think that always comes up as this question of like, it's like a totally different animal. It's like, well, it is different, which is true of SDR. I mean, our old standard images always look a bit different in print. We cannot do everything the same on monitor and print. This is just a new twist on a problem we've had since the earliest days of printing and monitors.
I like that you can still print them, you can still share them. It's really kind of the best of everything, because throughout the conversation, we've talked about modern cameras. They have, 12 to 14 stops of dynamic range. Our monitors are finally catching up, and now we can create these incredible edits based off of the actual data that we've always had. And not only can we share that the way we saw it, but we can also print it and still continue forward with photography just as we always have, without any real major disruptions to what we're already doing.
Yeah, I think at some future point, we might see some of these prints get replaced with electronic display. These, displays are getting much better at being, stable, where you could leave it on the screen for a while without burning and that kind of stuff, or cheaper and, bigger and all this kind of great stuff. We may see that. I suspect we're, going to see this side-by-side usage where some people will replace print with an HDR display. But of course, we're always going to have print, right? There's something very just amazing about this tangible print. There's things you just can't do with an electronic display you can do with print. So we're always going to treasure our prints, but I think we're going to see perhaps a new media show up, which will be a little bit of like kind of a digital print, if you will, on the wall. And I don't know when that'll be. It's probably a few years out before things get to the point where it really makes sense. Probably start showing up first on the big screen TV at home. That, I mean, I'm waiting for the moment when, Apple TV has HDR photo support, so I can just put it right up on the TV, wirelessly beam it from my phone, and voila, everything's set. I mean, I have to use like an HDMI cable to do that now, but like we're not far from the point where our televisions can already serve that purpose to have a beautiful display of these images. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time. I'm seeing at some of the trade shows I go to more and more exploration with these like high end TVs to put a frame around them, make them look like a print. Some of them look really pretty stunning. Even for SDR work, it can be a different media, and we might see some creative use of things like backlit acrylic and other things like that. And you can always do like a great print with the right kind of lighting on it. Can look amazing. So I think we're going to see some interesting creativity as people try and bring some of the joy we get with HDR photography, which is clearly the future, to a bit of the physical world in either electronic or print form. But I think we're going to see some interesting innovation there as time wears on and more people get into this.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking to myself that I believe it's Samsung. They made that TV called the Frame that it displays images or whatever you want while it's on the wall. And I think LG, it may have been, they just released a see-through TV that you put it on your wall or wherever you want it. And when it's turned off, it's essentially transparent, but it can still display things. The technology that they've got out there is just, it's so impressive. It's so cool to see and to think where this is going to be in another 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and I've seen some of that technology. When I go to these trade shows, they're showing off exotic technologies like micro LED, which is like even brighter, more impressive next gen display. And you can buy these now, but they cost like $120,000. 5 or 10 years from now, you might be picking one up at Costco. I mean, this could evolve pretty fast. Some of these things are really beautiful, and then there's things like Sony came out last year with a mini LED TV that will do like 4,000 nits, meaning it's like much brighter than even these incredible Apple displays we have. And they have a little bit of a partnership where they sell their own version of like a frame TV with that TV, where literally they put kind of a frame around it. And now you've got this like super bright TV that can do pretty amazing things. It's not going to be far before we start seeing some of these things show up for this kind of technology. I mean, I think the TVs of today are already well suited for this. The biggest thing that's missing right now is like a set top box to enable it, right? Like I need my Chromecast or my Apple TV to natively support the HDR version of photos. They already do HDR video, so it can't be far before if you can do 60 frames a second, you can certainly do just one frame. So as this technology continues to expand, the software support, I think is going to enable a lot of things that will start to catch up with the hardware, because the hardware is already in way more places than people realize, but it's been a little bit dormant because we're just now kind of catching up in terms of software and standards and awareness and education and just all these things. I mean, for me, I've been doing this for a few years, and I've been paying close attention to the trends. And I got to say that I'm just totally blown away at how fast it's moving. As someone who spends a huge chunk of my time on this topic, I am constantly surprised by the new things that pop up because, my audience is focused on this. And so people are just constantly alerting me to things I missed. And it's incredible to me how quickly this is all evolving.
Yeah. I mean, just before the episode, you and I were talking a little bit about technology and how fast things change and how it's amazing. It's great news for us photographers and those that are utilizing the technology. But like you said, there's going to need to be learning resources and areas for us to go to experiment and learn more and figure out how to keep up with all this. And you offer a lot of that on your website. I'll definitely include the links in the show notes below so that the listeners can go and check it out. Are there any places in particular you'd like to guide them to? You mentioned your Instagram where you've had some examples. And there's some samples on your website as well that are really interesting, really cool to check out with the sliders on there.
Yeah, I would definitely check out my feed on Instagram because most people are going to have support on their phone. And then gregbenzphotography.com/HDR is really kind of the hub for all these things. I've got tests for, what capabilities you have, information on how to get set up, demonstrations of all the different edits and gain map info. It's all the info is there. So that's kind of the one-stop shop for everything on that page. Um, and I will say, you were talking about like all this like constant change here. I don't want people to think that like this is like you're never going to be able to keep up with it, right? Like I'm trying to figure out all the technology so I understand what individual people are using and what's out there to help support them. But this is really easy to do with Lightroom. And if you follow the steps I share in my tutorial, it's easy to share this stuff on Instagram or on your own like self-hosted WordPress site today. The change I'm talking about is things will just become that much easier as time goes on and the displays will get that much more impressive. But ultimately, this is just a great time to get started because the things you learn now, you can put to use right now, and you can be an early adopter, creating images that will stand out from the crowd with this new technology. And it's clearly the future. If you look in the world of Hollywood movies, TV started getting HDR in like 2016. Go and try and find a movie that doesn't advertise availability in like HDR10 or Dolby Vision. They all have it. Look at PC gaming. There's like 500 PC games that support HDR now. Photography, it has just exploded in the last couple of years. So this is clearly the direction we are headed. And so when I talk about, this is a great time to get started, this is a time where you can get in, learn, start having a lot of fun and stand out. But just know that like this is where it's going to go. 5 or 10 years from now, I think this is going to be something that people know quite well, and it's going to be a bit of a universal standard because it really just is such a massive improvement in image quality that I think there's no turning back if you look at the way things are changing right now.
Yeah, I completely agree that just seeing it in your own images, you won't want to edit your images outside of that HDR range because they truly look that good. And when you see it, like Greg said, in person and you physically see the changes or see content that's true HDR on a high quality monitor, it just jumps off the screen. It looks alive and it's very exciting. I think that it's going to be one of those things where we made a giant leap when we went from film to digital. And now I believe we're at another historic leap in photography, in the art form as a whole, as we jump out of a 8-bit world into a 12-bit world of sharing images. And who, like you said, who knows, maybe they can go beyond that.
It's a much more capable world. And I think people are surprised when they look out there that a lot of people listening to this are probably already creating these images, don't even realize it, because this is now the native capture format of iPhone and Android. Once you start knowing what you're looking for, you should start seeing this in a lot of places. This is already kind of the default on our smartphones. I'm just talking about a better version where you're in control, shooting with a high quality camera and editing to get the most out of the medium. But chances are you're already getting kind of a quick snap on your phone doing this already.
And the great thing is that you don't need to go out and buy a brand new camera or a bunch of crazy stuff to do it. You can just use what you have and the technology's already in your hand. So exciting times are certainly ahead. And Greg, I want to say thank you for jumping in and having this discussion with me and sharing your insight. Like I said, I'll put all of Greg's links in the show notes below so you guys can check out his work, learn more on HDR, and go and check out everything we've discussed. But Greg, thank you very much for joining me for this episode. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, Nick, thanks for having me on the show. It's been a lot of fun. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you again, Greg. It was so much fun discussing this topic with you and learning more about the technology that's here and coming that is going to transform photography as we know it. I encourage everyone to head over to the links in the show notes below and check out the resources and information that Greg has put together on his website. Go check out his Instagram. There are some exciting examples over there that are really awesome, very cool demonstrations of this technology and what it is allowing us to do and how you can do the same thing as well. Next week, we are going to be joined by Jason Ray Photography as we discuss breaking out of our comfort zone and exploring new places, meeting new people, and the impact that it has on our growth as photographers. A Minnesota-based landscape photographer, Jason captures the many beautiful landscapes of the Great Lakes and beyond. It's going to be a wonderful discussion. Please do not forget to rate and subscribe so that you can be notified when the next episode becomes available. See you guys on the next one. Take care, everybody.